Well, Madam President and members, hopefully this will fill up the sunshine box. And for this Sergeant session, we're going to take a little stroll down a memory lane called Think Big and Rogernomics. And so we're going to have a classical multi-choice exam to which you'll raise your hands to vote. And if you don't get the right answers, please generously contribute. And if you get the right answers, please contribute as well. So the first question is, when did the second oil crisis begin? Now, if you think it's 1978, can you raise your hand? 1979? Yeah, and 1980. Okay. It started with events in Iran in 1979. The Iranian Revolution began on the 1st of February 1979 when Ayatollah Khomeini deposed the Shah of Iran, and Iranian oil production was more than halved. The near disaster at 3 Mile Island in March 1979 increased anxiety about energy policy in the US. Motorists began panic buying, long lines appeared at gas stations, carless days began in New Zealand. Next question, when did the Muldoon National Government publish its growth strategy? 1980, 1981 or 1982? So if you think it's 1980, one person. Oh dear. 1981. Okay, and 1982. Yeah, it's very interesting. Growth Opportunities in New Zealand was published in April 1980. The intention was to restructure the economy away from agriculture on the advice of the Planning Council, recover from the 1978-79 recession and stimulate imports. Roadshows involving cabinet ministers started in October 1980. They were wrapped up by the Prime Minister Muldoon at Trillo's in Auckland on the 1st of May 1981, and the policy taken to the 1981 election. So those of you who thought it was 1981, including Cabinet Minister here, are kind of correct. It was taken to the 1981 election, but the policy was developed in 1980. The present government's Provincial Growth Fund is bigger in real terms than the 1980 growth strategy. Isn't that interesting? When did Maui gas start to flow onshore? Was it 1979? If you think it's 79, can you show me? Yeah, oh, it's disappointing. 1980 or 1981? Okay. Prime Minister Muldoon opened the Oanui production station in Taranaki on the 31st of May 1979, enabling the Maui A platform to be commissioned and natural gas to come on stream. He revealed the plan which he had formed in his mind, and this is very significant, his words, at the time. We must apply ourselves, we must apply ourselves with unremitting determination to make our country as near self-sufficient in energy forms for everyday use as human technology and ingenuity can advise. Our long-term objective is the highest degree of self-sufficiency we can achieve in all forms of energy, which drove energy policy for some years. Who first coined the words think big? Was it Prime Minister Muldoon? No votes. Energy Minister Bill Birch? Or National Party President George Chapman? Okay. Prime Minister Muldoon adopted Treasury Secretary Bernie Galvin's idea of using the energy projects as a growth package and introduced the words think big to our politics in his rally address to 900 delegates to the National Party conference in Auckland on 26 July 1980. He said, and I quote, "We've got to say no to negative thinking. We're going to take the big decisions and we're going to push them through. If this means, as it does, we speed up the development of our electricity resources, okay, we'll speed it up. We've got to think big, and we're going to train the extra skilled men needed to put these projects in place. Restructuring is the only way out. We have got to have more farm production and more production, horticulture, fishing, farming and tourism. We've got to move in our energy program." So the president of the party, George Chapman, took up the theme and at the end of the conference urged delegates to think big when he summed up the conclusion of the conference. So a lot of people think it's George Chapman, and some people think it's Bill Birch. Bill Birch had nothing to do with it, to the formation of Think Big as it was at the start. Next question. What did the synthetic fuels plant at Motunui cost? 700 million? Any votes? 1 billion? Some more votes. 1.3 billion. Okay, well, unfortunately, you're all correct. The capital cost of the plant was $767 million US. It was built on budget, but allowance for inflation, interest, if you remember what inflation was back then, interest charges and working capital nearly doubled the cost to $1.2 billion. The plant began production in November 1985. Remember, I'm saying it cost US $1.2 billion. Finance Minister Cagle gave it plus 200 million in cash to Fletcher Challenge in 1990. It's still operating 33 years later. The chemical reactors to produce petrol from methanol were shut down in 1999. The plant is now owned by Methanex of Canada. It exports 2 million tonnes per year of pure methanol, worth over $1 billion per year, and that money goes to Canada. Which company proposed the second aluminium smelter at Aramoana? Was it Fletcher Holdings? You must remember this. Yes, there we go. Hooray. Was it Comalco? Or was it Ceramco? No. Fletcher Holdings proposed a smelter at Aramoana, and government approved it in principle in July 1980. Fletcher Holdings merged with Fletcher Challenge to create New Zealand's largest company in 1981. Comalco had already gained approval to build a third potline in Bluff. Both would have used up the electricity surplus at the time and the output from the Clyde Power Station. In the lead up to the 1981 election, Alu Suisse withdrew. Fletchers could not find a replacement partner, but all three potlines at Bluff are still operating 38 years later. Couple more questions. When were the state-owned enterprises formed? Now, you'll all know this one. 1986, 1987, yes, it was 1987, and 1988. The 9 SOEs were incorporated on the 1st of April 1988. They started with 67,500 staff in the 9 departments, and 32,600 were made redundant. Half of all the staff were made redundant through voluntary redundancy, attrition and enforced means. The social effects have not been systematically researched, according to Graham Scott, Secretary to the Treasury. Next question, what value, now you're meant to be putting money in if you get these answers wrong, so there's going to be a lot of money today. That's all the notes. What value was decided for the Electricity Corporation at its vesting? Was it 4 billion, 6 billion, yeah, or 8 billion? Okay. The value, this is interesting, the value which the Board of Electricity Corporation proposed was 3.7 billion, based on a private sector method using a price to earnings ratio. The book value was 3.8 billion. Treasury's proposed valuation was 11 billion, based on future marginal cost pricing. The parties could not agree, and the value was decided 7 months behind the target date. In March 1988, the chair of the Business Roundtable, Sir Ron Trotter, arranged a late-night meeting in Parliament between Ministers Roger Douglas and Richard Prebble and Electricorp Chief Executive Roderick Dean. Roderick was summoned after a Festival of the Arts concert, and Treasury was safely tucked up in bed. The outcome of the auction at 2 a.m. was the valuation would be midway between Electricorp and the Treasury, 6.3 billion. And the last question for you. Who bought the SOE Petrocorp? Was it British Gas? No. Briley Investments? Or Fletcher Challenge? Fletcher Challenge. Briley Investments did own 15% and the public owned 15%. British Gas won the first round for 70%. So British Gas did win it. But they put many legal conditions on the offer, and SOE Minister Richard Prebble rejected the British Gas offer. He offered Petrocorp in a phone call to Hugh Fletcher in March 1988 for the same price but with no conditions. It took Hugh just a few minutes on the phone to accept that offer. The price was $800 million. Petrocorp owned 50% of Offshore Mining Limited, which developed and sold gas from the Maui field, the Natural Gas Corporation, which owned the gas transmission pipelines throughout the North Island, Petrel Gas, whose world-scale methanol plant operated near Waitara, and Petrochem, which owned and operated the ammonia urea plant. According to Brian Gaynor, it was the bargain of the century. President, thank you. I hope there's plenty of money in the pot.